All right, check, mic on. I'm as fast as those junior high kids. That's actually how I pulled my hammy. I was racing a 12-year-old or 13-year-old. I pulled my hamstring. He beat me at a tryout the week before, and he came to the next tryout because he just loves baseball. He just wants to be there all the time. And I go, I'm beating you tonight. And then I was doing okay, and then I got to about third base, and we were running a 60. And I was like, oh, and I was out for 2 weeks. Yeah, he's unfazed by it, but I was out for 2 weeks. But anyway, so. Yeah, I need to coach 7-year-olds. I bet I could beat a 7-year-old. Yeah, I could beat a 7-year-old. I just can't. 13-year-old starts to get into that realm. I can't beat them. So, well, this morning, I thought it might be good to take a little bit of time to do a little bit of Q&A with Rebekah. So Rebekah is here. She spoke yesterday, and she is with Jews for Jesus. She's part of our Christ in the Old Testament feast, and what did we call it? Christ. What was the name of the? Christ in the Old Testament. That's what we called it. I don't remember the title of the conference. Yeah. Huh? Oh. Yes and amen. Oh, that's the title of the conference. Yeah, the shirt. That's the shirt. All right. Anyway, I was here for it. I just don't remember the title of the conference. I mean, I knew the topics and stuff. I watched all of them. But anyway, so it was really good. But we have not had Jews for Jesus here since prior to COVID, I think, was the last time we had Jews for Jesus. Now, we've had Jews for Jesus here several times. The first time we did, actually, this building wasn't even here. It was in the other building, probably 2005. It was probably the first time we had Jews for Jesus here. And you remember that guy? Really nice guy. He stayed with us, I think, and accidentally left something at the house. So I had to meet up with him again later, which was great. We got to go to dinner. And so I got to hear a little bit more of his story and things like that. He'd actually come to faith because he was listening to C.S. Lewis' Mere Christianity on Audible is how he came to faith. Really interesting story. I really enjoyed getting to know him. So, but anyway, I thought it might be interesting for us to take a little bit of Q&A. And so I'll invite you up. There's a microphone here for you. And we can even sit down if you want. That way it's feels less lecture-ish. Plus my hamstring's bothered. Yeah, I pulled a hammy. So I need to sit down. So anyway, so this class, this is for very rudimentary theological studies. We're just finishing up the book of Revelation. And so we try to keep it really simple in here. And we're going to move from that to Micah and Isaiah as our next two studies. So we're trying to keep things as low-key as possible in here. So yeah. Anyway, so you are from Brooklyn, New York.
So I've lived in Brooklyn for the last 12 years. I was born in Austin. And then right before I started kindergarten, my dad had a job change. And so we moved to New Hampshire. But my dad grew up in East Dallas. And my mom, my grandfather flew C-130s in the Air Force. And so she lived all over. But he retired in Waco. And so, yeah, coming back to Texas feels oddly nostalgic. Like there's things that I have bearings in weird places. Sure. But yeah, I grew up in New Hampshire. I live in Brooklyn.
All right, very good. I actually grew up in Austin, Texas. That's where my hometown is, so very good. All right, so Brooklyn, New York, and I understand, have you encountered any Matthew Road people in Brooklyn, New York?
So we visited the Borough Church a couple of weeks ago. And so Zach and Caroline send their love, and Bethany and Rebekah and Jonathan and my son have made very fast friends. And the church that we've been going to meets at 11, and my 2-year-old has decided that is about when she loses her mind and needs to go to sleep. So Zach and Caroline's church meeting at 2:00 is a very helpful sort of tool in our toolbox to keep our family in church on Sunday at a time where people can not lose their minds.
I've found that many people get their best sleep between 11 and 12 on Sunday mornings. Has been I've noticed that. So I don't blame her at all for this. I've noticed a pattern of that. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so you tell us a little bit about how you came to faith.
Yeah, so I grew up with a lot of proximity to Jesus. My dad's Jewish, and my mom isn't Jewish, and my mom comes from generations of really strong, committed followers of Jesus, especially in the women's line of my family. And so I come from a really strong heritage of faith on my mom's side, and then my dad grew up in Dallas in the 60s as a Jewish person, which was, I don't know, real or perceived, but for my grandfather didn't feel like it was okay for them to be out as Jewish people, to be publicly Jewish. And there was a lot of dysfunction, a lot of brokenness in their family, but Jesus was really pursuing them. And so my grandfather married somebody who loved Jesus, and they started going to church, and my grandfather got saved, and my aunt and my uncle and my father all resisted for a long time, and Jesus kept pursuing them. And so my dad, coming out of the Navy, came pretty aggressively to the end of himself, and Jesus met him in a way that was really powerful and supernatural, and so I grew up in a home with parents who decided, as they were deciding to get married before my brother and I ever came along, that we were going to grow up in a home that loved Jesus and was really proud of being Jewish people. Part of my dad really coming to faith was really healing for him and being able to reclaim all of who God made him to be. And so that included that we were going to grow up not afraid to be Jewish. And so, I grew up going to Wednesday church and morning church and night church in Austin. And then on Friday nights, we would be part of a Messianic home group, other Jewish people who believed in Jesus in Austin. And so I grew up with a lot of proximity, and I was getting a lot of information. And I'm sure, I don't know if it was after Sunday school or Pioneer Girls or after VBS, but I prayed to ask Jesus to live in my heart when I was little, 3 or 4, and was told I was too young to get baptized. I remember that very concretely, and but I really wanted to get baptized. I loved Jesus, and it was a process of really understanding that it wasn't just, okay, so I've prayed the prayer, I've got a ticket to heaven, I've got Jesus in my heart, that somehow I missed that there was more to life with Jesus than just saying yes. And so when I was 14, we were living in New Hampshire. My parents were friends with the people who were serving with Jews for Jesus in the Boston area. And they were friends with the people who were directing Jews for Jesus summer camp for kids who were growing up just like me. Kids who had one or both parents were Jewish and one or both parents believing in Jesus. And going to that summer camp very much against my will, because I was a delight at 14, I think as many of us are. It was the first time that I could remember going a whole week without having to explain to somebody how I could be Jewish and believe in Jesus. And so because I had sort of a break from arguing and defending and just sort of being who I was, I could really encounter Jesus. And so it was sort of that week at camp that I feel like Jesus got a hold of my life in a way that was real and dynamic, and changed my life. And so the process of my growing up in Jesus and growing up in my faith really was discipleship with Jews for Jesus. And so I just kept saying, as there were opportunities, kept saying yes. And so I came back to camp the next summer and then did a missions trip. And then I came back and did the missions trip the next summer and was camp staff. And I have been directing the summer camp for the last 8 or 10 years and I've been serving with Jews for Jesus for full time, about 13 years. But my faith has really been shaped and nurtured by the ministry of Jews for Jesus, and so it's a real privilege to then be able to serve in a place that's blessed me, and to see other people, young people, grow up in their faith.
All right, good. We have another former Jews for Jesus missionary, Alan here. Alan has a connection to Brooklyn, New York too, right?
We were comparing neighborhoods.
Yeah. So, and hearing Alan's story was really encouraging. At some point, we'll have Alan share his story too. I mean, he taught a few weeks ago, but we'll have him share a story at some point. I've heard your story. I'd love for you to share it. But it was just interesting when they emailed me and said, well, we have this missionary, and she's from Brooklyn. I was like, okay, well, we're 2 for 2 with Brooklyn connections here, and Zach. It's like, wow, there's a lot of Brooklyn connections here. So anyway, it seems like too someone else was Brooklyn. Is Chris the Wolf from Brooklyn? I think Chris might be from Brooklyn too. But anyway, so yeah. Anyway, okay, so the ministry of Jews for Jesus in Brooklyn, New York, what does that look like? What is a weekly, well, obviously you mentioned the summer camp, so you're involved with that. What does it look like weekly for Jews for Jesus there in Brooklyn?
Yeah, so Jews for Jesus is a big organization in sort of like the Jewish missions world, but in sort of the scope of what does the missions world look like, very, very small. I did a leadership development program a couple of years ago, and a lot of my classmates worked for Salvation Army, and I was like, oh, we're very small. And so then our work in any of our places, but Brooklyn especially, looks like a lot of things. And so I have coworkers who their Brooklyn work is focused on sharing the gospel with Haredi, with Hasidic ultra-Orthodox Jewish people. And this, I would imagine would be shocking to you. It's shocking to me because I forget that the Jewish people are an unreached people group, like statistically as it relates to all of the missions sort of numbers worldwide. Jewish people are an unreached people group, and they're, we're not on an island somewhere. We're everywhere. And so I have coworkers who are trying to do really pioneering things to reach people who have done a really good job of being unreachable, not just to the gospel, but to a lot of 2024 and what might be available to them. And so that's an aspect of our work in Brooklyn. My husband, his name is Sam. My husband trains all of our new missionary staff, and so we're based in Brooklyn, but his work happens primarily on Zoom as he is training our new missionaries all over the world. And then my work is I co-direct our family discipleship programs for North America. And so some of that's a summer camp, and some of that's a teen missions trip to New York City. But a lot of it is one-on-one and small group Bible studies with kids who are growing up, and teens who are growing up just like I did, trying to encourage them to, no, you can read the Bible. Here's how we read the Bible. If you can pass your English class, you can read the Bible. It's a book. You know how to read. We can do this. And easier than your English homework. You have access to the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, but I can give you some tools. And so yeah, a lot of my work looks like coming alongside of young people and their parents. I feel like it's somewhere between a coach and a mentor and a spiritual midwife of helping parents say like, no, you're not going to screw up your kid. Like you might, because parents and we all do, but this is not going to be the thing that messes up your kid. Holding on to a Jewish identity and pursuing faith in Jesus, that's not going to be the thing that breaks your kid. And there's a value to being a visible witness to that a Jewish person can believe in Jesus. The first followers of Jesus were all Jewish, And Jewish people need Jesus because all people need Jesus.
That's amazing. You have, so connection to you for Jews for Jesus would be primarily through their corporate website, or do y'all have a, for your ministry specific type thing going on too, or is Jews for Jesus website, that is the conduit to you and what you guys are doing?
Yeah, so I mean, the Jews for Jesus website is probably that's the best hub, probably. But I've got our prayer letter on our table, and it's got my email address on it and my husband's email address on it, and that'll get you right to us. Our work in New York, which that's the office that I work out of, it's in Greenwich Village. We're a block away from NYU. And so as you see on the news, whenever there are protests, you will see the neighborhood where the office is. The protests are never as big a deal on the ground as they get cut and edited on the news. But as you see them, you can remember us and pray for the work of Jews for Jesus in New York. We have a coffee shop and an art gallery. We're really looking to have spaces where people can be around, I mean, not just Jewish people that believe in Jesus, but people who believe in Jesus. For New Yorkers, even people who have experience with church or who have sort of Jesus in their story, people in New York are trying to make it. And whether that's theater or that's sports or academics or business, there is a lot that's loud in New York, and I think we're trying to help make people's first associations when they hear Jesus be a friendly face of a person who loves Jesus and loves them, and not people who think a certain way or vote a certain way or assume a certain thing about them. That New York is a place where people don't assume good things about people who love Jesus.
Yeah. I can't understand why. It's not like the church has contributed a little bit to this, but all right, yeah. So, okay. Y'all have questions for her? Oh, Alan has a question for you.
Yeah, so Alan asked about protests and about just opposition to, I mean, I guess everything we do, to being Jesus people and to being Jewish people. And this last year has been really hard. I don't know if for any of the women who were at the symposium yesterday, Sue talked about that the last and greatest day of the Feast of Booths is a day of rejoicing, and that is still true. When Sam and I first got married, we lived right on the border of an Orthodox neighborhood, and people were partying in the streets. That was loud, and that still happens. And October 7th was the last and greatest day of the feast last year, and so the day that we're commanded to rejoice was a day we were also holding intense mourning and intense fear. And this has been a year where I have thought about anti-Semitism in a personal way for the first time. This has been a year in our work with Jews for Jesus where our branch director, knows the number of the police precinct and checks in periodically on if there are just sort of credible threats in the water for Jewish people. And so we hire security now when we have public-facing events. And that's been true for a lot of our colleagues who serve internationally for a long time. But it's been a hard year. It's been a year where were the words and the concern of friends who love Jesus asking if we're okay has been really loud and means a lot. And where the silence of people who feel complicated about Israel or about Israel-Palestine and have not said anything has been really loud too. And so I think, just on that front is that if you know Jewish people as the October 7th anniversary comes up, just let them know that you remember and you care about them. The Holocaust wasn't that long ago, and this has been a weird year of wondering if I have friends who would hide me or hide my kids. And that feels really bizarre to say out loud, but I don't think that that's a real practical need, but it's been a strange thing as a parent to be thinking about that this year.
Yeah, in fact, Rosh Hashanah is the 4th, right? October 4th? 3rd.
Yeah, I think Wednesday night.
Okay.
So yeah, Thursday.
And then Feast of Tabernacles starts the 15th?
That sounds right.
15th to the 23rd? I think that.
Yom Kippur is the 12th.
Let me look.
And then the 16th, yes.
16th through the 23rd, I think, is so on this. There's a tough anniversary, but I wonder too if like for us 9/11 is a date, but I wondered if there was an attack on on Memorial Day, whether the date would be less significant than the holiday, and I'm kind of wondering of that for Jewish individuals who like you said, the day that's supposed to be a day of celebration, this coming here in 3 weeks, it's not the October 7th date as much probably as it is the celebration of that event. So I'm kind of wondering, how's that play out? I suppose that people in Israel and maybe even outside of Israel have, just like 9/11, I mean, you're in New York, so, 9/11 every year, there's always some sort of, properly so, remembrance and things like that. I just wonder, is there plans for that? Have you heard much about October 7th versus the end of the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles?
Yeah, so I think, it's one of the places where it's really helpful that we're on different calendars, that the Jewish holiday calendar is a lunar calendar, and so the holidays move around a little bit. And so everything I've seen is that all of the commemorations and the memorials will stay October 7th, 10/7 because it's not America, and so they invert month and day. So 10/7 is the way that, 7, whatever.
7/10.
7/10.
7/10, yeah.
There, it's morning still.
That's right,
That 7/10 I think will be the day that sort of stands as the memorial, so that we can take our holiday back. So one of the things that happens in that holiday, sort of in modern times, is so the Jewish world internationally is on a reading plan. And so every Shabbat, every week, there's a piece of the Torah, of the Pentateuch that's read, and then there's a paired reading from the prophets and the writings. And that cycle starts and finishes because it's on a scroll. So we get to the end and then we roll back to the beginning on the same day. That's what we're celebrating on the last and greatest day of the feast, is that we've made it through the Torah in the year. And so it's a celebration of God being faithful to give his word. It's a celebration of God preserving his people for another year. And so I think people are going to fight really hard to be able to reclaim that as a day from antiquity, and October 7th can be October 7th.
That I could understand why they'd want to separate those two. Yeah. All right. So yeah, big time of year for the Jewish calendar coming up here. Then, when we were up seeing Zach and Caroline, it was right at Feast of Tabernacles. right in that time period. I don't remember exactly where it was in that time period. I just remember Aaron Judge was about to break the AL home run record because we were sitting in right field at Yankee Stadium. And that knucklehead waited to come to Texas and beat it 2 days later here. I'm like, hit it to me. You were at the game?
Nerve.
Yeah. So I know we were there during that time period. And I remember where Zach is, it's not too far from the hospital there. What's the hospital? Is it the Hebrew?
Maimonides. There's Maimonides. There's a bunch of hospitals.
Anyway, so yeah, and so we were right there, and it was during that time period. It was on a Sabbath, though, so the activity was down quite a bit. But all the Sukkos were up, and we could tell I think they were about to hit into that time period, but all the Sukkos were already up, and so that's still a very real part of the Jewish calendar is that time period. I'm assuming Hanukkah as well. Those times of year are just like they like really do it big.
Yeah, there's in all of the parks in New York City that an organization will set up like a bigger sukkah for people who don't have yards, which is most of us, and who don't have balconies, which is also most of us, or fire escapes that are like safe to put a sukkah on. But it's really wild. This time of year, there are like ads on telephone poles that are like, rent a sukkah. And so you like dial a number, and then like they bring it, people set it up, and then they go home.
So it's like the Christmas light install people. They have a
1,000%.
site. That's genius. Mm-hmm. I love it. Okay, that's cool.
Because people can't store stuff in their apartment, so you rent it, they set it up.
Yeah.
You call them, they come back and get it.
Well, I was struck too because it was a string of houses that were fairly, like they were all connected, but it wasn't necessarily apartments or whatever, but every one of them, like one after another, and so elaborately decorated everything. I was impressed. I was like, wow, this is really, really cool. That whole neighborhood. So I was just thinking about that, and then in light of this calendar time period, how it's going to be a mix of both joy and sorrow with that. So, wow.
Yeah.
Someone else have a question? Anyone? You have one?
Yeah, so Kim was asking, just sort of in this last year, I had it, and then I was going to repeat it, and I lost it. Visible persecution for visibly Jewish communities, and then for Jews for Jesus, and open doors. Yes? Okay. I think as far as persecution for sort of the more visibly Jewish communities. So one of the things that's true of very Orthodox, very religious Jewish communities is both that sort of they are visibly identifiable, but because of the way that they understand and keep Sabbath laws, there's really limited distance that they can be from their houses of worship because of what you're allowed to do or carry on the Sabbath. And so they end up living in close proximity to one another. And so I remember last year, Columbus Day was, the Monday after October 7th, and so my kids had off of school and figure out what to do with them. And so we were at a children's museum that's very close proximity to one of these communities. And so there were a lot of other Jewish families, there were visibly Jewish families that were there. And we came out, and I noticed that there were plainclothes officers with, the coil, plainclothes officers, but also uniformed police in the neighborhoods. that I don't know if they were responding to just sort of assumptions about what might happen subsequently or if there were credible threats. But the New York Police Department, I think because they've got a long time that they've been had these visibly Jewish communities be part of their constituents, they respond. There were, most of them were pretty isolated, but there were definitely anti-Semitic acts that were violent towards the community. There were definitely anti-Semitic acts that were violent on the campuses. More Columbia than NYU. The police, or the campuses and the police responded very differently at Columbia and NYU. And Columbia was dangerous, and NYU was fine. But especially immediately after October 7th, people were, especially sort of more secular Jewish people, were leaning into, okay, well, we're Jewish. People are going to know that we're Jewish. It might as well mean something for me. Like, it needs to be something that is part of my life, because if there's a list and there's a problem, I'm on the problem list, so I might as well show up on purpose. And so people were more frequently in synagogue, and people were showing up at the Jewish Community Center, and some of it was just being together and to be with other people who also didn't have words for this fear and dread and not knowing how to think about like the just political instability in Israel. I found myself wondering for the first time in my life, like, oh, Israel might stop. Like, we might not have a political Israel. That's weird. That's terrifying. Like, the state might fall. That can happen. And so we had, so our coffee shop in New York is called Moshava, which means village in Hebrew, because we're in the village, but we're also wanting to create a village in the city, a neighborhood, a place to belong. And so because it has a Hebrew name, that's a signal for Hebrew speakers, for Israelis. And so there were a lot of opportunities in the immediate wake of October 7th. There was a grief group that came together, a couple of Israeli therapists. One was a therapist, one was a social worker, volunteered to host a group in our space, to volunteer their time, knowing that we were believers in Jesus, knowing that we were Jews for Jesus, but hosted a group for unsaved Jewish people, Hebrew speakers, and our staff who are Hebrew speakers and are Jewish and love Jesus would go and were part of the group, partly because they're Israelis and it was a place for them to heal also, but tons of openness and extended conversations, and we've seen people come to faith. We've seen people ask questions we wouldn't ever dream of them asking. And so, I mean, God is always at work redeeming broken things, because there's nothing else for him to redeem. There's only broken things. But this has been a year where we've really seen brokenness at the surface.
Yeah, so right after 9/11, that was a Tuesday, the Sunday after we were packed out. I'm assuming that synagogues the week after October 7th were probably more packed out than normal too. That would be the natural response. Like you said, wanting to be together. In some ways, also just maybe a search, like, God, where are you in the midst of this? But also this idea of community somehow helping in the midst of the confusion or the pain and suffering. Because to me, the October 7th is much like our 9/11.
Mm-hmm. And it will be Israel's 9/11, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it shakes the nation to the core. It has a reverberation throughout the world. To me, it felt much like, and will change things going forward, much the way 9/11 did. I mean, I think 9/11 really altered our world in ways we still haven't really grappled with.
New York is a much friendlier place on this side of 9/11 than it was before.
Really?
I didn't live in New York before. I was in 8th grade at 9/11, but everything I see of New York on, you were in New York before 9/11, everything I see, of what people think of when they see New York is a place that, sure, it's like there's a lot of people, and so there's a lot of all kinds of people. But, we live in New York with our kids. We don't have plans of leaving unless God calls us somewhere else. We ride the subway with our kids. And it's more complicated now that my 5.5-year-old is reading. So there's things to explain, but that's probably true anywhere. But yeah, I think after the Tree of Life shooting, the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, so there were a lot of calls from different Jewish leaders of different Jewish communities, sort of saying show up. If you were going to be here anyway, the next Saturday, the next Friday, show up. If you weren't going to be here anyway, if you are free, show up. That this is a time where Jewish solidarity means a lot. And so I think that sort of instinct, that muscle, was sort of already in place. And so, for sure, that some of it was a let's be together, and some of it was to whatever small amount you can say, take that, Hamas. This is not.
Sure.
But yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, rightly so. Let's see. Any other questions? When?
I've heard of your organization, and my pastor in the Midlothian state works, and his dad ran a camp up in that area somewhere, understanding Word of Life.
Uh-huh.
But I don't know much about Jews for Jesus, so I'm learning a lot. It's really interesting. I didn't know you did camps and all this outreach to kids and stuff like that, so that's really cool. And I'm not trying to be funny, but your issues as a Jewish unbelieving person are very similar to the Muslims. And so I wonder, do you ever have crossover with, do you ever interact with the Muslim community in New York? Are you able to reach them? I know with the title that's probably not, but maybe you work with different, is anybody reaching out to them the way you're reaching out to them?
That's a great question. So he was asking about that a lot of the sort of resistance to the gospel or the closed communities reminds him of just sort of what he's heard about Muslim communities, and asking sort of what the interface is, or if there's people that are extending outreach ministry to them. And I know that, so for our missionaries who are doing work in the ultra-Orthodox communities, they've met a lot with missiologists who've got experience. So people who are experts in how do you share the gospel cross-culturally? How do you share the gospel with people who aren't like you? So that when you're speaking and talking about Jesus, you're using words that they can hear. And so that there's been a lot more work done in Muslim countries and in work done to reach people who have come from Muslim backgrounds with the gospel, because the Muslim population of the world is much, much bigger than the Jewish community. And so we've really, really valued, I know that those teams have really valued the experience and the expertise of people who've spent time in Muslim community sharing the gospel. Our neighborhood, where my family lives, is sort of most of the kids, so it's sort of a third. That when I've done sort of chaperone field trips, there's about a third of the kids that I know of who are in like secular Jewish homes. Most of them are intermarried, so they have a parent that's Jewish and a parent that's not Jewish. That's like a good third of the class. A third of the class is native Spanish speakers, partly because my son's in a dual language Spanish program. But a lot of them the kids are either first generation American or they're coming from somewhere, but are native Spanish speakers. And then about a third of the class are from Pakistani Muslim backgrounds. Most of the kids are pretty secular, but there have been a family or two. And so we're having opportunities to get to know people and live life with people, and as much as we can to build relationships and to be people who love Jesus, who to the best of our ability aren't jerks, because that's not necessarily, people just haven't had that opportunity. It's not that they've met people who love Jesus who are doing a bad job, it's that they just hear it on TV. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Wynn's unique perspective on our interest in Islam in particular, you spent, how long did you spend in Turkish or northern Iraq?
Oh, wow.
with the Kurds, and I've seen it. So
Yeah. How long were you there?
I've seen Arabs and Kurds who were, killing each other under Saddam. The same people together.
Yeah.
Yeah, the gospel does incredible things.
Yeah. How long were you there? 8 years. So, yeah. I don't know if y'all knew that about Wynn.
My mother-in-law taught Middle Eastern, she's a Middle Eastern history expert, and she taught it at Biola in LA for a long time. And so speaks Arabic and spent time studying with, in Arabic archives and libraries in Jerusalem for a long time. And so she's got a lot of friends who come from Muslim backgrounds who are now followers of Jesus, and that's a real heart and a passion of hers.
Wow. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, Richard.
Excuse my ignorance, but the Jews for Jesus and the Orthodox Jews, what type of friction is there? And since the attacks, has there been more unity between those two groups?
That's a good question. So, a bunch of different sort of facets. Okay, so for Jewish people, in just sort of history, I think probably going back to like after the destruction of the temple in the 1st century, when Jewish people were expelled from Jerusalem, that there's been anti-Semitism and persecution towards Jewish people from people who on some level identified with Jesus. And so for a lot of Jewish people, and I think especially people who are visibly, obviously Jewish, sort of more of the Orthodox, the religious populations, the idea of a Christian and a Gentile are interchangeable. And so for Orthodox Jewish people, they don't know the difference between somebody who is a Christian and is a member of a church and loves Jesus and would love them, and somebody who's just not Jewish. That's what a Gentile means, the nations. And so it's just like everybody else. It's like there's Jewish people and then there's everybody else. It's most of the world is the everybody else. And so because Jews for Jesus is that's pretty clear in a name. Like, all right, we are Jewish people who are for Jesus. We say that you can be Jewish and believe in Jesus. It's a pretty easy thing for Jewish people, Orthodox, secular, anywhere in between, to say like, well, Jesus, no, but Jews for Jesus, like, triple no. Because there's an element of betrayal, that there is an understanding of if Jesus is the reason that people are mean to us, which is a lot of the understanding of the Jewish world, if Jesus is the reason that people say it's okay to be mean to us, that people can accuse us of killing their Savior, then people who say they're for Jesus and are Jewish, who cares what they believe? They're now aligning themselves with the bad guys. And so for Jewish people, so modern Judaism, also called like rabbinic Judaism, modern Judaism started in the 1st century. After the temple in, 70, 80 something, outside of Jerusalem, all of the surviving Jewish leadership got together and they said, okay, so we don't have a temple and we don't have the land. How do we be faithful Jewish people? Like, what's Judaism going to look like? And so biblical Judaism ended, and so like Christianity was getting formed at the same time that modern Judaism was getting formed. And so there are a lot of ways where modern Judaism was put together to answer all of the questions people might ask so that they didn't ask about Jesus. And so there is a lot of good, important gospel work to be done as people who love Jesus and love Jewish people, to be people who love Jesus and love Jewish people. Because I think for most Jewish people, they have no plausibility structure. Like, there's nothing that enters the imagination of how Jesus could be good news for them. And so they're not saying no to Jesus because they understand who Jesus is, and they're saying no in almost every case. They are saying no to Jesus because they can't imagine how Jesus could possibly be for them. I don't know if that answers parts of that or answers your question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a terrible indictment on the church. And we know historically the church has responded so poorly at times. The Crusades didn't help. Martin Luther himself wrote some incredibly anti-Semitic texts. We know that in America that at times Christianity's been used as almost a cultural, ethnic phenomenon in horrific ways, which not just Jewish people, but other ethnicities were targeted as being inferior. We know that, unfortunately, those voices were quite loud, and I think still today we deal with some of the fallout from the use of Christianity out of some kind of personal axe to grind. And it's not unique to this, by the way. All of us have to watch ourselves on this, that Christianity is not some tool to create a universe I want it to be like, and therefore it's used either personally or politically or any other way as a means to get what I want. As soon as Christianity gets reduced to that, you get this kind of outcome, which is that the obvious approach here has nothing to do with really the biblical Jesus or biblical Christianity. It has more to do with enough religion to get what I want. And we've seen it historically. It's heartbreaking. It has incredible negative impact on Jewish people. I think we would also say it's had some pretty devastating impacts on other minorities in American history as well. I think Christianity was used pretty extensively. Nominal Christianity is used extensively in the slave trade and things like that as well. So it's a real tragedy that in the name of Jesus, I think the one thing that keeps me from despairing over that is just that Jesus warned us that people would do this. It's the one thing that keeps me from despairing over it, is that Jesus told us, by the way, bad people are going to come and try to take this message and use it to their own end. It's the one thing that keeps me from despairing completely, because it is frustrating to see exactly what both of you have described, and I think, like I said, unfortunately, there's other minority groups that could also say some things that aren't too positive either about it. When Christianity gets, so it's a challenge for each of us, right? I mean, like, if Jesus is really our Savior, and this gospel, we say we believe it, then the love we have for other people is not a negotiable aspect of our faith. And we should love individuals who are Jewish and not Jewish. Muslim, as you brought up, is sometimes, I think, a problem for modern American evangelicals as well. I think it's a real challenge for us. Do we really believe in the Jesus of the Bible? And if so, the heart check then on these things is really, really critical. It's one of the reasons I love the ministry of Jews for Jesus. We've had you guys, like I said, I don't know how many times. We've had Jews for Jesus do Christ in the Passover at least 5 or 6 times, but we also had Christ in the Tabernacles once done here. And we built Sukkos out front and stuff. Like we had that one time too, which was really cool. So we've been, as a church, we've entered into this realm a little bit because of Jews for Jesus. And I think it's good for us as a church to be praying for Israel, to be praying for the Jewish people that are spread all over the world. There may be no group as dispersed throughout the world as much as Jewish people. I mean, just, I don't know. It's pretty phenomenal if you go, well, there's a huge population of Jewish people in Brooklyn, New York. You go back 2,000 years ago and go, what are you saying here? Yeah, so.
So all the missionary staff with Jews for Jesus share Christ in the Passover for like the 2 weeks before Easter, and so everybody gets sort of assigned their location. And for 5 or 6 years, my territory, for whatever, the place I knew, but only for 2 weeks in the spring, was like Utah, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Colorado. And there are more Jewish people who live in Brooklyn than there are people who live in the state of Wyoming.
For that matter, there may be more Portuguese people in Texas that live in Utah. Anyway, or Wyoming. I'm just kidding. Yeah. No. That. How many Jewish people are in Brooklyn?
Between 500,000 and 600,000.
Wow.
So 500,000 Jewish people just in Brooklyn.
Yeah, I mean, you just think historically. In Brooklyn, yeah. You just think historically, if you go back to, say, 1776 or whatever, the American Revolution, there's no way anyone would have scripted into that 500,000 Jewish people living in Brooklyn, New York. Like what? So
yeah, New York State, it's about 2 million. It's the
in
largest city population of Jewish people in the world is in New York City. Mm-hmm.
Okay, wow. Well, thank you so much for your time. We're running out of time, and I also want to give you a chance to be out there. Let's pray and be ready for our next worship time. God, thank you for your mercy and grace. We're praying for Rebekah. Please bless her and her ministry, her family. I just pray for them, God, that you would fill them with your joy, you would empower them by your Spirit. Thank you so much for their ministry and their encouragement that they've been to us already, and I just pray for your continued mercy for them. I pray for Brooklyn, New York, for Jew and Gentile alike.